and bring Appropriations Committee meeting to order. Oh, I get to hear myself on a short delay. A permanent delay would be better, but first bill for consideration, we're just going to take these. We'll do Senate File 98 quick. Senate File 98 is a joint appropriations bill that takes the relief funding. You go through it if you remember. We've got the expiration. The COVID deadline runs out on March 26th. So all those programs that we created in that special session and elsewhere terminate on March 26th. All that money is then reappropriated to the governor so he can reallocate it among the existing programs. As you meet the bills on 5, starting on line 16 after March 26th, amounts authorized for expenditure by the legislative appropriation of federal funds provided. The state under the amendment shall not be revised, changed, or distributed to increase the governor by the governor except or pursuant to legislative enactment. So we're just trying to also keep that little one on there. Section 2, you see that there's reappropriated from unexpended funds $50 million to the office of the governor, responding to those just COVID relief expenditures. Expenditures under this section shall be reported to the legislature through the B11 process. And so that's what this bill does. So with that, anybody have any questions about any of that? Does anybody speak on Senate File 98? Anybody speak on Senate File 98? Randy, do you have anything you wanted to tell us on Senate File 98?
Mr. Chairman, before we do, would you mind if I take the roll?
Oh, okay, good idea.
Thank you. February 16th, 2022. Senator Grew.
Here.
Senator Hicks.
He's here.
Here. Thank you. Senator Kinski.
Excused?
Senator Steinmetz. Here. Chairman Perkins.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Anyone? So, Rennie, welcome.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Spoke with you, was that just yesterday, on the language that is similar to this in the ARPA bill, and did just want to again reiterate that the governor did feel that the handshake approach worked over this last year. Understands your position as the appropriators, but just again, his commitment to work with you is always going to be there, with or without a bill. But if you're moving this one forward again, if there is the language to work around the 604 section of ARPA and broadband, would just be appreciated to line that out given the deadlines that are in that section of the ARPA bill. So I believe you made it as a conceptual amendment earlier this week. So if there was something to align with that, as this is moving, that is the main item that I'd flag for you.
And Rennie, we've got on page 6, we've got that 50 million. We've got that in 2 places now. And so what we'll probably do is add something probably in the ARPA bill, that in the event that this passes, so that we don't have a 50 and a 50, we'll do something to make sure that there's that 50, so we're not doubling up. But other than that, I think we're all on the same page, right?
I believe so. And again, without a bill, the governor's committed to making sure that you work together. He appreciates that you're recognizing the need for flexibility, and that I will have all gray hair if we're spending money on a pandemic here over the next few months. But just given the possibilities that forecasting what's about to happen with a virus of this nature, you leaving some of those dollars or working with the governor to know that he's committed to, if you're giving him some flexibility to respond to any crises that come up, as you have in other ways, is a partnership that he appreciates a lot. But without a bill too, same thing remains, is that we recognize that there's a role for the legislature as appropriators, and then definitely need to keep an eye on in case something is to happen here over the next few months.
And Rennie, with respect to, I know we get reports on it sometime, but as far as, that's the stuff on the CARES Act. The rest of this, most of this the 50 million in that has to do with the ARPA, but most of this rest of this was with CARES Act and the wind up with the CARES Act. I mean, my recollection is last time we talked, it was about 11 million. It's less than that now. Just what, were we down about 5-6 million now, or where are we? You know?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know where we are today, but yeah, I think you're in the neighborhood. I would assume it's 6 or 7, and about just saw Supervisor Kropatch. The bulk of that, I think all but $1 million of that is with the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. And that was that Energy Rebound 2 program. And so they've been processing the invoices. They're all for work that was done in line with the CARES Act in 2021. And we're just processing invoices. But I think I've heard we're going to process all but about 100,000 of that.
It's interesting. They've got kind of a tight timeline, but you know, when they reconcile and want their checks on for forest fires, wildland fires, and highways, usually it's 3 or 4 years before they finally get their number and get it to you, but we got to respond more quickly. But hey, that's what happens when you have the money, you make the rules. Okay, any other questions for Rennie? All right, thank you. Anyone else to speak on Senate File 98? Anybody in the room, Karen? All right, committee, what's your pleasure on 98? All right, any amendments? Okay, let's call the question.
Thank you. On Senate File 98, Senator Group. Senator Hicks. Senator Kinski.
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz. Chairman Perkins.
Aye.
5 aye.
Thank you. So let's do Senator Ellis. I see you back there. Senator Ellis, let's bring you up. So the rest of these are re-referrals. So let's take, we're on a re-referral on Senate File 32. So Senator Ellis, what we normally like to do is just do a super quick 30,000 foot overview of the bill and then just take the appropriation and help us understand the appropriation. Okay.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Senate File 32 addresses I would say the top priority for your Senate Education Committee, and that's tackling the importance of early literacy. You'll recall a few years ago that we switched from PAWS, it's our form of testing, to YTOP. And when we did that, a lot of school districts were using the YTOP test as a screener for whether or not a child has dyslexia or other reading difficulties. We started hearing from school districts that YTOP wasn't a great tool. In fact, Natrona County School District wanted to exempt themselves and waive out of that requirement, which prompted the question of, well, if this is a bad tool for Natrona County, isn't it a bad tool to use across Wyoming? So we started learning more about the difference between assessments versus screeners. And so what we're really trying to do is flag those children early on that are struggling readers that maybe have dyslexia and other forms of difficulty. So in doing that, you'll see that this bill requires the Department of Education to develop some criteria for what kind of screeners we're going to use in the state of Wyoming. And along those lines, we want to make sure that the teachers which have interaction with those early learners, your K-3 students, have adequate training to make sure that they're aware of what they should be looking for to identify those students. So with that, you'll see the request for the appropriation of $300,000 from the School Foundation Program, which would be used specifically to train those teachers. I'll tell you that you'll see that there's some language in there, you know, what if the amount exceeds the $300,000? In your committee this morning, Senator Rothfuss and I actually talked about ways of reducing potentially that amount of $300,000. So looking at paragraph E on page 5, that's where you're going to see the professional development requirement. Currently in the bill, we have language that says, you know, each year these teachers have to get this very specific professional development. In working the bill this morning, I think we agree that you might have teachers entering the system that are already familiar with how to use these screeners, so we wouldn't need to retrain them necessarily. We also thought it'd be overkill to require that specific training every year. So you'll see on Committee of the Whole an amendment by Senator Rothfuss and I to remove that each year requirement, maybe providing training every 3 years and not necessarily requiring that training for teachers who already have had it. So hopefully that should reduce the need for that entire $300,000 appropriation. In talking with the Department of Education, they weren't able to crunch the numbers on what that new number might be. But it is our understanding that anything that isn't expended for that professional development would revert. So happy to answer any questions, but this is a very key element of the bill. And I would say it also is aligned with what we're seeing a lot of other states do. Not surprisingly, Wyoming's kind of falling behind in this regard. But states all across the country are really focusing on the kind of screeners and professional development that we've got contained in this bill. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions for Senator Ellis? Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Vice President.
Mr. Chairman, that was a pretty quick review of the bill, but when we get to this, so this would be administered through grants to the different individual school districts, as I understand it right, to help do interventions for what they're supposed to be doing already, which is teaching our kids to read. So what's the real, I mean, what's the issue here that we're trying to get to, that the districts can't function to perform their normal duties anyway?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the distinction is right now, the block grant covers instruction and really assessment. This is a different concept. We're not trying to get more tests in the teacher's day-to-day. A screener, if done adequately with some training, is a 5 to 7 minute per child exercise. And so that's the goal. It's really to focus and keep it outside the model so that we're focused on that early literacy piece, so that they're using the screening tools the way that they're supposed to flag those readers to see if they need additional intervention.
I do have a question, Senator Ellis. So in Natrona County, I think we've gotten really pretty good at this in Natrona County. The CDC, which in Natrona County is the Children's Development Center, it's not the Center for Disease Control, but the Children's Development Center, they do that. But in Natrona County, we're finding we've got about twice the rate of, about twice the national average of children who fall into this category and need some kind of makeup. And I've been concerned over the years that, when you're a hammer, everything's, pretty soon everything starts to look like a nail. And so as you look at the developments involved here, I mean, obviously we want to identify kids and help get them up to speed. Will this help us with that? Will this help us make more professional assessments? Or is this going to result in that we just find pretty soon everybody's not reading to level, and we just expand there? So have you talked about that? Where are we at, and where do we see this going into the future, and what do we see this looking like as this moves forward? Is it going to go up? It's going to go down? You think it's going to relatively remain the same? Is this a pilot project, and so we'll see an expansion later? Help us with that.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was just trying to be brief. We'll get deeper. So one of the big concerns that we had back when we were talking about this transition from pause to Y-tops and screeners and why aren't kids learning to read, we started uncovering kind of a fight in academia over what is the best way to get kids to learn how to read. In my era, I was taught very phonetic-based learning. You see a letter, you sound it out, you connect those sounds, you sound it out, and that's how you decode a word. Over the last 30 years or so, teaching has really shifted from that kind of method. And I'm going to oversimplify this. I'm not an expert, but to something called whole word literacy. And so kids, including my own, are taught to use guesses and clues. So what that means is if they see like a kindergarten reading material, they might see a horse in a picture of a horse in a book, and they can maybe infer from clues around the sentence that maybe the word is pony, even though it sounds out like horse. And so these are strategies our kids are taught. Look at the whole sentence, kind of memorize what those words look like. My kids did this, like memorizing what words look like, but they weren't really taught how to decode a word. And so for a lot of kids, that method of instruction of teaching works really fine, especially if they're at home. They've got a lot of, family conversation, their parents read to them. They just kind of pick up naturally the ability to start decoding those words. But for some other students, that's a failing method of teaching. And so as they advance in grade levels, that inability to decode a word becomes more complicated, especially when pictures go away, when you start having math problems that they can't make sense of. So it really impacts like the continuum of learning. So when we worked on that shift from pause to Y-tops, I asked, well, why aren't teachers teaching phonetic anymore? And I learned about this very controversial fight in academia over the science of how to teach kids to read. And so what we're trying to do with this bill is expose teachers who are very much, I'd say, focused on whole word literacy. There are nonprofits right now that are doing this work of saying, what about this method, how we used to do it. And again, I'm oversimplifying a very complicated and very controversial area in education. So those teachers can go back to their classroom, work with some of those kids and see if those strategies work better. And so that's the kind of specific intervention we're hoping to achieve, I think, with some of this. So that's why you're going to see us talking about criteria for what kind of screeners, and this will all involve school districts so that they can develop that criteria through rulemaking, along with some of the professional development. So it's meant to be, we're trying to balance the ability of school districts to weigh in on that process, but also really getting after the fact that we are not satisfied with our proficiency levels. We think we can be doing better. And this is in line with what a lot of other states are doing. I don't think I have the number and the data in front of me. We had a national reading expert who came out, and we can talk about his research, but fascinating. You'll, in a nutshell, be interested to know that in the human history, human beings have always transmitted information orally. And so we are able to study what happens in your brain for you to start communicating and understanding and retaining information through oral language. And so he's looked at the scientists we had come out and talk to us, talking about the science of reading, what's happening in your brain when you're making those connections of sound to letter compared to whole word literacy. So this is really a first step for us to try and get after just, making sure teachers are exposed to multiple methods of teaching how to read. Because that's the longer explanation, Mr. Chairman.
And so do this turn into a reoccurring biennial, or it looks like to me it might even be an annual expense? Although obviously we're not going past. So you got 300,000 for 2022, you got 300,000 for 2023. Looking at the fiscal note, and 2024 it goes to zero. But at that point in time, is anticipate this rolls into the budget, or is it refined, or where do you see this going in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the more we have teachers, the critical mass of teachers that are exposed to, maybe they were only taught one method at their university, but become aware of this. Our goal and our hope would be that teachers see the value in having multiple strategies for teachers to use. So in the future, I would hope that school districts would say, you need to do professional development. We're going to encourage you to do this if you don't already have this training, and use their existing PD money. But I don't know that we've thought that out fully, and beyond what you'll see in the bill here. But really, this is a push to get all of our early K-3 teachers up to speed on, different methods.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead, Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just with that in mind, I was wondering if you thought about the college system that we fund as a state, and how we train our teachers when they're in college, because it seems interesting to me that we're having to teach them how to teach reading again when they're supposed to be a trained teacher when they come out of college. So just, have you explored that at all?
Mr. Chairman, yes. So back when we did the pause to YTOPS transition, that was one of the first questions I had. If most of our teachers are coming from the University of Wyoming, what are they teaching over there? There's a literacy research center and clinic that I used to sit on the advisory board of, and hadn't been exposed to this big literacy war out there. So we started asking those questions of the leadership at the College of Education as well as the LRCC. And I think, I started personally seeing firsthand just how ugly, for lack of a better word, this war in literacy is. And so since that time, the University of Wyoming has hired a new college dean. Senator Scott and I were involved in some of the conversations that went into, looking at the credentials of who those individuals and those candidates were. And I think we're very encouraged by the new leadership at the College of Education. Along those lines, the LRCC had a director who has moved on. They had a new director, and then that person, I believe, just announced her retirement. So they'll be hiring a new position, and certainly plan on reaching out to the LRCC to see what kind of candidates they're looking at, and have rejoined the LRCC. I was a little dismayed by the direction it was going under prior leadership, but with the change that we've got now at the College of Ed, I've actually rejoined that advisory committee because I care so much about this issue.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr.
A
Vice
couple
President.
questions. When you go to the fiscal note, it references the interventions required under WS 21-3401E. And I'm looking at that, and it has some pretty stringent requirements on there. And so I'm looking at that. So it already identified an evidence-based intervention program, and it says they're supposed to have individual education IMPs. School districts are supposed to test for K-3 on these already, so we got an idea, and then report back. And so I'm assuming we know which school districts that are already falling behind on this. So that was one question. So we already know where we have problems. Is that correct?
So, Mr. Chairman, because of the transition from pause to Y-tops, when we made that adjustment to say we need intervention-based screening tools, one thing we're grappling with is how many the districts are using now. I don't have my notes in front of me, but you would think, I think that's the struggle that we've had, is allowing the districts to have some flexibility in the number of screeners they use. But it's been all over the map, and some of them, you could argue, don't satisfy that evidence-based requirement. So we've had extensive conversations with the Department of Education, particularly during this interim, that, we would like a more robust reporting of what kind of screeners are out there, what they're seeing, and all that correlation, but that wasn't really available. So our effort here is also to kind of narrow the numbers so that we're getting a little bit more apples to apples comparison when it comes to how these screeners are comparing to one another. So I don't have a great answer for you. That's something we're working with the Department of Education to improve get more or better data from their reporting.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the reason I asked that question, when you get on down there, it talks about the $300,000. So I was assuming that was generated on some data that there's a number of school districts that are probably underperforming, but then it talks about if there's too many applicants, it'll be prorated. So I just was trying to figure out whether this is targeted money because we know we have problems, or we're going to just broadcast the money out there in all 48 school districts. And that was the reason that question come up. And so I'm just trying to figure out, is this enough or is it not enough? Do we have data that we know where we have problems where we can remedy that with this? And that's the rationale behind the questions. And then, Mr. Chairman, I have one more after.
Yeah, Senator Hicks, I'm batting for the big guy. He worked, I'm sure, more with the Department of Education on how they generated that number. They generated that number. I think it sounds adequate, but I think we were, again, just trying to acknowledge that school districts have plans, professional development they'd like to use for their schools. So we didn't want this to seem like an unfunded mandate to them that we're dictating what kind of PD they provide within their resources. So this is a way for us to hopefully track it and make sure that those dollars are used for those specific literacy.
Okay, Mr.
Training.
Chairman, then just a follow-up question. Was there any discussions with the Department of Education where their ESSER 3 funds would have been eligible to fund this program?
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I don't recall. I don't know if I can tell you no or yes on that. I don't think so. I don't know that we explored that too much.
Can you, if you talk with Senator Scott and just maybe have that information for us when we get out on the floor?
Happy to. I'm doing my best.
Mr.
You're
Chairman.
doing great. I didn't anticipate we'd be grilling you like this. This got pretty interesting. So anyway.
Oh, Mr.
thank
Chairman, I
you.
anticipated
So I
this.
apologize for that. I told you I made it sound like it really wasn't laying a trap for you. Go ahead, Senator Steinmetz.
Mr. Chairman, I think Kari might be able to tell us. She's kind of waving.
Oh.
over there.
Hey,
We always allow you to phone a friend. Thank you. I didn't even see you walk in. How are you? And did you hear our questions before? You need them repeated? I don't know how long you've been in the room.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Kari Akins, Chief Policy Officer of the Wyoming Department of Education. I have been in the room since Senator Ellis did her bill presentation, so I have heard the discussion up to this point. So you may have to prompt me again on some of them because I may not cover everything on my first try. But as far as the use of our ESSER funds, we are planning to use those for a portion of, we did in our fiscal note indicate administrative impact on our department, but because we have the ESSER funds and we also have funds from a competitive grant, federal grant that we received, a comprehensive state literacy development grant, we will be able to use to cover any administrative impact to our agency. And then I will admit the $300,000 is a little bit of a compromise because we are already using ESSER funds for literacy, to provide literacy trainings. And one thing that's going on right now is specifically a letters training that we will be hoping to continue for several years going forward. So we do know that there will be districts will be able to, and teachers will be able to, if they choose, use trainings provided by the department using those ESSER funds for some of that training, but we also know that some of that training will likely need to be specific to that school district to do team trainings on some of the specific screeners and assessments that they are using. And so, the department that would not be able to be provided specifically by the department. We might be able to take some of those on a requested basis. With some of our earlier ESSER pots, we were able to do some mini grants to school districts, so they were able to apply to those funds for some of their individual uses. But at this point where we are just starting to get into that third pot of ESSER funds, we are planning on making literacy training a priority of that, but we do know that there will be some districts that need to have specific training for the screeners and assessments that they use.
I think the other side of that is that's with your part of the ESSER funds. The departments, what about the school district side of the ESSER?
So, Mr. Chairman, because of the learning loss that is likely associated with COVID, we do believe that that would be an allowable expense of their ESSER funds, but that would be up to that district and those local boards. And some districts, are further into spending those funds than others. So I would anticipate that is an allowable expense of those funds because it is focused specifically on early literacy. And we know that that was one area where it was tough to make progress when school districts were closed in spring of 2020 in an area that we're concerned about the lack of progress that some students made.
And with this, so this will be a grant, will be a grant application process to the department in the end?
I believe so, Mr. Chairman, because we would like to see that they have used their block grant professional development funds before going to the state for this. We want to see that they're using those, that those funds in those way first, and that they need more because of the training that's being required in this bill.
Would it be possible in that analysis and the grant funding to ask them about how they've applied ESSER funds to resolve some of their own ESSER funds to resolve some of these problems?
Mr. Chairman, we can ask that question. However, the federal government has made it very clear that the state, if it is an allowable expense, that the district then has the authority to choose which allowable expenses they use those funds on. So we cannot require a district to use their ESSER funds on something like this. We could make it very clear that it is an allowable expense and then provide the drawdown. But the guidance that we have received from the U.S. Department of Education makes it very clear that that decision of the use of those ESSER funds for school districts is up to those school districts to decide, as long as it is an allowable expense.
So is there federal government's very good at manipulating these things and creating quote an incentive for individuals to use certain money in certain ways. Do you believe that that's permissible? For example, this grant money be available if they match it with local ESSER dollars, or is that an impermissible enticement?
Mr. Chairman, I would have to double check because there are slight differences between the third pot that came through American Rescue Plan than with the first two. And I want to make sure I give you correct information on that.
Okay.
But I will follow up with you on that.
Mr. Vice President.
No, I think that the question that really was, where did you come up based on assessments that we currently have in the intervention plans? So do we know where our problems are at? And is this money going to be focused at those problems? Or are we just going to make another grant program for anybody to apply for it? But through the current assessments that we have and the intervention statutes that directs us to this literacy component, do we know where the problems are?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, we are getting better at identifying that. This statute was, there were some major alterations to the statute just a few years ago, and we have made some good progress in that time that has helped us see clearly that this teacher training is needed. And so,
if I can just interrupt, to just get a little bit more specific, I think we're trying to figure out is like, do we know if it's Fremont 9? Do we know if it's Natrona 1? Do we know if it's Laramie 3? I think that we're trying to get, we know when what districts those problems are occurring, and is there some way to focus these grants in those areas instead of just saying, all right, here's money you can apply for to do training in this area? Have we gotten down to that level on to know where those skills exist in our teachers and where they don't?
So, Mr. Chairman, I think one thing to understand is that the goal that is put in statute and the standard that has been put in statute is to have 85% of students proficient by grade 3, which would, and the standard for that is the grade 3 YTOP assessment. We do not have a district that has met that. So right now it is that everybody is below the standard. Now, certainly by evaluating those scores and through the information that we've started collecting from school districts, thanks to that statutory change a couple of years ago, we do know where the more severe issues are regarding literacy in our state. And so I think that if the body wanted to find a way to focus the funds or prioritize the use of those funds to those districts that are struggling more, that is something that we could put in place.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, that's exactly what I want to do, because it's been my experiences, the good programs will come in and get better at the expense of maybe one of these very rural school districts, small districts that doesn't have the staff. And we need to target this money where we need the most help. Not to say that we don't want everybody to get better, but if we know what those are, that's where we would seem to set some priority for those districts that are struggling or need this intervention money. I understand the whole 85%. It was an objective and a goal. We should have some level of empirical data to say, where should we really target this help?
Mr. Chairman,
Here, go ahead.
if I
Senator.
may, it's not that simple. I wish it was. As I mentioned, old school, I had a phonetic, my first grade teacher, we sounded out everything, but there was a shift in education nationwide where teachers were taught whole word literacy. And so you'll see kids that can adapt and learn from that method. But if all of this, like a generation of teachers were taught that one method, I think that's our concern is, maybe you've got a district where, there's a lot of parental involvement. But the bigger, the other thing we don't want to lose sight of, it's not just about reading, it's also about dyslexia. And so, even if you've got great reading scores, if you have a high number of kids with dyslexia, are they targeting those kids sooner, better? And so it's not just here's a, based on your reading scores. I think it really is a statewide issue of a philosophy of how we're approaching the science of teaching children to read. So I would just caution that that's not our goal. It's just to say, these are the most struggling schools. There are a lot of factors that contribute to that. It really is kind of a shift of making sure all of our teachers are exposed to a wider opportunity or wider methods of teaching.
More tools in the tool for them.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, one thing that was discussed earlier and the necessity of this is just the fact that the importance of the screening that is in this bill, and then also the parental notification and involvement, is to have that intervention happen as soon as it is realized that it is necessary, because that is where interventions are the most effective. And it also can help reduce the number of students that need severe interventions through IEPs later on in their educational, in their time in our educational system. So that was one area where when we look at cost pressures on our educational system, we do know that the special education costs continue to rise, but we can see that if we can have early intervention on many things, it may be able to assist that student in a way that they never get to the point of having to be on an IEP because they receive that good early foundation in reading to help them right at the start. So just wanted to add that to this conversation.
No, it's one more follow.
One more follow. So, Mr. Chairman, so with all these things, how are we going to measure success? So what's the metric that say this money actually did what we think it's supposed to do?
Mr. Chairman, I think what we're looking for is improved reading proficiency in YTOP and NAEP. On reading, I think the goal too is to see improvement in math. How many of your math assessments have word problems? And you talk to teachers, if you're a struggling reader and you've got a word problem, you have no hope of understanding the problem to do the math. That's the goal, is to improve kids' learning across the board, not just K-3, but all the way until they graduate. So we're trying to push in that area. If you talk to Senator Scott, he'll tell you this is our first cut at this. I think this is going to be ongoing work if we're going to have meaningful, impactful improvement in K-12. So it's a work in progress.
So and I'm not going to ask the question now, but if you can get to me, what are those metrics? And I think you referenced maybe just reading scores or something, but if there's something else out there, it'd be helpful.
So Zeph, for those of us who are the an acronym impaired, NAEP and YTOP, I've heard of NAEP before. What's YTOP?
Yeah, White Top is our state assessment. NAEP is the national assessment.
And that is that limited to reading, or is it broader than that, like the old standardized test?
NAEP is reading and math, and I'll let Kari get after the rest of it.
Mr. Chairman, the major areas where NAEP assesses students is in grades 4 and 8 in math and reading. They also every few years will add in science, but every 2 years in grades 4 and 8, a representative sample of students take NAEP for math and reading.
And YTOP?
YTOP by statute is grades 3 through 8 in English language arts and math. And then also for science, grades 4, 8, and 10.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Senator Kinski.
so Kari, I don't want to get too far afield because we're just supposed to be looking at the appropriation, but I do have to ask. I thought the department already had, I thought the department already had a statutory mandate to do what Senator Hicks had asked, that where there are districts that are seriously underperforming, to go in, system of supports, apply pressure and resources to get them whatever needs to happen to get them going. Am I wrong? Does the department have that kind of system in place? Is there not a statutory mandate for that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, certainly there are certain measures the department can do, but for the most part, schools do have to submit school improvement plans to the department that we approve if they are not meeting or only partially meeting expectations under the state accountability model. However, there may be many reasons why a school is not meeting or partially meeting expectations. And oftentimes what we see in the accountability system, I think, are more the symptoms instead of the root. And so this is our attempt at getting at the root. I will also say that the statute that was in place here, we started some good work on that a couple of years ago. There was a lot of confusion and misinformation about the requirements of this piece of statute. And so we have been very focused on this work, and it is complicated work, as I think you're figuring out just from this discussion. We're very appreciative. This was the topic that the Education Committee spent the most time on this interim, because reading really is at the foundation of all educational success. If a student does not learn how to read, they're going to struggle throughout the rest of their journey. And so we need to make sure that we get this right. There are multiple components to it, just as this committee has already been able to figure out, as far as making sure that our teachers are being trained, at the universities the way they need to be. A piece of this bill is making sure that there's better parental involvement as there needs to be. But we do believe that this helps strengthen the ability to make sure that school districts are using the tools that they need to be using to make sure that students are getting the help they need at the moment they need it.
So, Mr. Chairman, follow up. I'm still unclear. Do you have a statutory mandate to actually go in and help these districts? I heard send in a report. So you get a report, they're not performing, you say, send us your plan. They send you a plan, and then what? Does the department ever come in and actively intervene in a district that is poorly performing to try to get them up to standard? I assume that's in the statute. If not, tell me.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, that is a part of the accountability, but we have not had any statewide accountability determinations in 2 years now because of the pandemic, because we were unable to collect the data that we needed to collect. And so at this point, it's a little bit back to square one on a lot of things because of the pandemic.
Okay, could you send me the statutory citation for that, the interventions with the school districts? Just send me the stat and I'll just look it up and read it.
We'll do, Mr. Chairman,
Great,
Senator
thank
Kinski.
you.
All right, thank you. And I think this was one of your, this was one of the, like I was talking about. I think we know, and I'm talking to Chairman Scott, that this was something you guys had identified last year, and you spent a lot of time on this interim. This is kind of this was your flagship bill, is that right? Okay. Go ahead.
But there's that absenteeism bill until, I'm just kidding. No,
I'm
this is
sorry, what's
that
that?
absenteeism bill. I think it'll be our third time looking at it. No, this is definitely our priority.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other questions? Thank you. Anyone else to speak on Senate File 32? Go ahead. Hello, Bill.
Mr. Chairman, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I spoke on this bill when it was presented in front of committee. You've gone down a slightly different path. I would have to remark that I have great respect for the appropriators of this world because you're the guys that get to say no when nobody else is willing to do so. In my experience in other parts on my active duty in the Navy. I believe this rises above that. Because of the vagaries of active duty in the Navy and moving around a lot, one of my children developed a serious reading problem in first and second grade, partly because of the classroom environment. And it took my wife and I, mostly her, she has a master's in reading education, about a year to figure it out. Yanked him out of school in early fourth grade, took him to a 2 weeks phonics course that was taught, I believe it was in Florida. And that mostly fixed the problem. To this day, he still has a bit of a reading deficiency, but he graduated from UW, so he got past most of it. But you get into some things. Senator Hicks asked the question about what's a measure of success. My wife served as a reading literacy instructional facilitator in a school district that had, when she came there, had slowly declining ACT scores. She was reading in literacy for IF for middle school and high school. During her tenure there, about 3 years, their ACT scores turned around and went up about 8%. I offer you that's partly a measure of success. You would ask where the problems are, and I would ask you to take a look at the dollar flow within districts, where they put them. And IF is funded 75% by the state, 25% by the district. As I looked at how my wife was handled, they were focused more on things like insurance costs and other things, and they decided not to continue her, and they terminated any kind of a reading and literacy IF. Just recently, that same school district is now putting in for a grant to fix reading and literacy issues. I would submit if they had kept her in place, they might have already had that answer. So at the end of the day, the dollar flow is very important. Measures of success are important, and first and second grade are absolutely essential, in my opinion, to the future of Wyoming for reading and literacy. And I think that's exactly where you guys ought to be focused. That's what this program does. Certainly, there are other things beyond that in other grades, but I submit to you that this is very important, subject to your questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Bill. Questions? Questions? Thank you, Bill. Appreciate your time. Anyone else to speak on 32? Anyone else to speak on 30? Anybody in the room? All right, we'll go ahead and close off public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure? Okay, any with respect to the appropriation, any questions or amendments at this point? Okay.
$300 million. Any district applying for.
Let's make that 300,000.
300,000. Now, what's a few zeros in one spread?
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Harper brain.
Mr. Chairman, I do think it's important that we need to understand, we're just not continuing funds. I want to find out the district recognize they have a problem. I would just say that it requires we appropriate the $300 million. We offer it through $300. $300,000. And it requires a one-to-one match from any source from a school district participating in the program. So if they want to use ESSER funds, block grant, 2002 reserve funds, whatever it is, they have the opportunity to recognize they've got some ownership in this program.
Okay, is there a second? Is there a second? Okay, got a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. All right, that motion is adopted. Have you got that, Karen? We need to go
I
back and
believe I
circle
got
back.
most
and
of
get.
it. It requires a one-to-one match from any source.
From any source.
Okay.
Okay. All right, any other amendments? Any other amendments? All right, let's call the roll on the bill.
Thank you. On Senate File 32 as amended, Senator Guru.
Aye.
Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Kinsky. Senator Steinmetz. Chairman Perkins.
Aye.
5 aye.
All right, thank you. Senator, next is Senate File 8, Weed and Pest Reorganization. And looking at this one, I guess that what this does is, I think this bill is simply transfers an account and the funds into the account. But I was a little bit struggling about where the appropriation is. So anyway, go ahead, Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To give you a little brief overview, we're in the process of transferring the weed and pest from the state lands and investments over to the Department of Agriculture, where we feel it'll probably meet some of the people that are on the ground more with it, and hopefully we'll continue to have good control of the weeds and the invasive pests and all in state lands as well as local lands and all. In the process of that, on page 3 of the grant, or I'm sorry, of the bill, notwithstanding any conflicting provision of law, on July 1st, 2022, the governor shall transfer to the Department of Agriculture $300,000. And then any property and equipment within the Office of the State of Lands and Investment is necessary to implement this act. And so we're just merely asking that the $300,000 would be transferred over to the Department of Agriculture because it's necessary to take care of those weed and pest problems on areas where leases and others are not taken care of. And I would stand for any questions on that.
So go ahead, Senator Kinsky.
Mr. Chairman, I'm too tired to be diplomatic, RJ, but it seems to me that the Office of State Lands has done so little with respect to weed and pest. I'm surprised they have $300,000 in the property equipment that's really been devoted to it. How did you determine that they actually have property and money?
The property and the equipment would be a collaborative effort between the two of them to work over. So hopefully they could work together on that. We're not saying, here's what you got to do. We're saying, is there a collaborative effort on the equipment and any property that they use, sprayers, if they had sprayers, or any particular property that was directly related to the weed and pest operation.
Okay.
It would
I
be
got
what
you.
would be moved. We're not
Okay, I thought you
talking
were talking
about
about desks and chairs.
desks
All right.
or file
All right. Thank
cabinets
you,
or
Mr.
anything.
Chairman. Thanks, RJ.
Right,
And
thanks. And RJ, excuse
Yes.
me, Senator Cost. I'm hearing that there's
okay.
not $300,000 in the, I think there's not $300,000 in this account to transfer. I'm
well,
hearing that. What, did you guys talk about that at your committee?
we did, and of course, the state lands and investment are here, and they can talk about it more, but in the cuts last year, it was our understanding that 300,000 was cut out of the funding because of the government's request for reducing budgets.
Okay, that was a level 2 or level step 2 or step 3 cut.
One of those cuts.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Okay.
Any other questions for Senator Cost?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I just wondered, I don't see Department of Ag here, and so I'm assuming they're okay with absorbing this and administering this program, and that's all well and good.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
Senator Simon, I should have said Chairman Perkins, I'm sorry. They were at our committee meeting. They are fully supportive. They had no problems. They were happy to take it on. So they did not express any problems. They also said they would work collaboratively with state lands on spraying their land and taking care of those places where there's weeds and pest problems. So,
All right,
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead.
I see Assistant Director Crowder's here. I've got a couple of questions. Maybe if we could have him come up. And maybe he needs to bring his friends with him too that might have some of the answers to the questions.
Yeah, we're
Or
certainly willing to let you phone a friend and you can do it in advance if you want. Hey, Jason, how are you?
Always good to bring your accountant to a JAC meeting. That's right. So, Mr. Chairman, the first thing, what has been the average annual expenditure that OSLI has spent on weed control on state lands and say for the last decade? What's the average?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Hicks. Again, my name is Jason Crowder, Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. We've had an active weed and pest program going back to the 07-08 biennium. Back then it was funded at $750,000. It continued at $750,000 for the biennium until the 11-12 biennium. It was reduced then through a statewide budget cut down to $712,500 for that biennium. Stayed there until fiscal or the 15-16 biennium was also reduced through a statewide budget cut down to $412,500. And then in the 17-18 biennium, it went down to $350,000. And that's where it stayed until the phase 3 budget reductions from the last biennium, where it was reduced down to zero. Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, the expenditure on that is roughly 90 to 100% depending on the biennium you ask about. I don't have those figures right in front of me, but we also went through a rule change in 2009 to get broader use of those funds, increase the amount of money going out to the districts. And it's important to note that the program that we manage is a cost share program. We don't spray directly. We work directly with the weed and pest districts across the state, and they send us invoices for costs that they incur for state land expenses, and we reimburse them through this program.
So, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad you're at the cost share, and I know that it's a part of the terms and conditions of most of the leases, whether you're an oil and gas leasee or an agricultural leasee, to keep track and spray the weeds. These were direct appropriations specifically for weed control within your budget. Is there anything budgeted currently after the budget reductions that we went through for weed control in your budget? Is the 350,000, or is there, what's the balance in that? And is there anything in the current budget that we're working on?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, there's nothing in that budget right now. We did lose all that money in the phase 3 budget reductions. However, we've supplanted it with TP&E funds that the legislature grants us through exception requests each year. The legislature last fiscal year did provide us $500,000 specifically for weed and pest work on state lands. It's important to note that that account, the TP&E account, is funded through the school foundation account, and that we are very specific that those funds are applied to only common school identified lands and not the other beneficiary lands that we manage.
That was my next question. So we've got zero in the weed account now. So this would be moving money out of the TP&E account, which I believe we put 3/4 and $750,000 or roughly that into the budget. So it would reduce that appropriation, well, just transfer it over to the Department of Ag at 300,000. I just wanted to verify it does come out of the school permanent land fund, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure, Senator Hicks, where the school foundation account gets funded, but you all know that better than I do. At the moment, that is a one-time funded account. We come to the legislature each biennium as an exception to have it funded. So if funds are transferred out of that account over to the Department of Ag, as the proposed bill talks about, that is not a long-term situation. That is a one-time at present time.
So, Mr. Chairman, the other thing comes up is this the way this bill's structured. I don't see anything in here that would say this would come back in the Department of Ag's request as part of their annual appropriation or becomes part of their permanent budget. So it just is something that we may want to consider if this bill moves forward. Because then we'd have to have if that's the point, wouldn't we just direct those funds out of straight to the Department of Ag as part of your continuing and list them as X5 for school foundation instead of having to do a transfer?
I don't know why we wouldn't do that. And you've been in this business a little while, Jason. I mean, when I look what this bill does, I think it says, it doesn't say where it directs, it just directs the Department of Agriculture or the governor to transfer $300,000. Doesn't say where, doesn't say from what account or anything else. This is, you send it over here and any property and equipment within, and I don't know if the 300 is within OSLI, there's not many other places for it to be. And any property equipment, you transfer that over. So what way I interpret that is property and equipment's easy, but what you told, I don't think there's $300,000 to transfer. And so, but yet this bill requires you to transfer $300,000 to the Department of Ag. The way I read it. How do you, but you've been around this business a while. How do you look at it? What do you think that tells you to do?
Well, Mr. Chairman, that's a fair question. We don't have equipment or anything like that to transfer. The amount of FTE that we expend on this program, because we work directly with the districts and they do the heavy lift with our lessees, is less than 0.1% of our staff, meaning that they're dedicated to other projects and programs within the agency, and taking a computer, a desk or something like that just seems unfeasible because there's not that much that we could transfer over to the Department of Ag. You are correct also that if the expectation is the 300,000 is taken from our biennial budget, our standard budget, we would have offered that up in the phase 3 budget reductions and not gotten rid of this program if we had it. We didn't have it, so we had to look at this program to fit the needs of the phase 3 budget reduction requirements. So we don't right now have $300,000 separate from the TP&E account, I suppose, to provide in this bill, if that's the expectation.
Okay. All right, I got it. So thank you. Any other questions for Jason? Any questions for, okay, thank you very much. Anybody else wish to speak on Senate File 8? Hey, Pete, how you doing? Come on up.
Chairman, just a letter that Senator Kinski and Senator Cost were supposed to receive from just so that you know.
Make sure you give one to Carol.
Well, I only have that. So.
She's our ramrod. She's our, okay, all right. Okay.
You have?
Do you want this one? Yeah, just a second. Pete Illaway, Mr. Chairman, working with weed and pest districts. As I think this letter from Larry Smith, President of the Weed and Pest Council, does show that the Weed and Pest Council wants to do the job. They felt that the $300,000 would be adequate. But again, I'm sure that that's on a yearly basis, or I'm not even sure whether it's biennial basis, but I know that the weed and pest districts can do the job. They've shown that they can do the job throughout the state. And I think this is important to continue. I might just say that 30 years ago, when I would work weed and pest, same problem. So weeds never stop growing.
Okay. Good notice. Thank you. Any question? Thank you, Pete. Any questions for our former Representative Illaway? Thanks, Pete. Anybody else speak on Senate File 8? Anybody else speak on Senate File 8? We'll go ahead and close off public comment. I'm not sure what we do here because there's not an appropriation. I don't know, and without, you know, there's kind of sort of an appropriation, but not really.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to rectify that.
I don't know we have the power to do that.
Well, can we make an appropriation?
Yes, we don't do that, but you could. No, I'm kidding. You, Mr. Chairman, as long as it deals with appropriation, we can deal with appropriations. We certainly can.
We can make it. We're the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Chairman. We should be able to appropriate.
I was just quoting some from Senator Nicholas from years ago. So
No,
go ahead, Mr. Vice President.
Mr. Chairman, with the, what I'd like to do here is at this point, Karen, it's a little bit conceptual, though. It's just say that we would add an appropriation for $300,000 directly to the Department of Agricultural's budget out of the school foundation, specifically for use for matching grants on weed control on state lands, and just forget the fund swap between the TP&E over to the Department of Ag and just make a direct $300,000 appropriation. And that the Department of Ag would be required, that wouldn't become part of their standard budget, that they would have to bring that back to the Joint Appropriations Committee. Conceptual.
Second.
Second, 300K from the SOP to ag for CSDLF lands.
Okay.
And require only for matching, for matching grants.
And the anticipation is the matching comes from lessees or other users,
Lessee
or maybe even state lands. But actually the 300, the matches is from state lands essentially.
well, in some
'Cause that's
cases,
where
there's a
the-
lot of other match money that's been out there through the Wildlife Trust Fund, the Game and Fish
Okay.
Department Mule Deer Initiatives, and Rocky Mountain Elk
Okay.
Foundation. So there's other sources. It would just require a one-to-one match on those state lands, and then whatever those weed and pest districts. I know we've used a lot of federal funds that we're eligible to use on state lands, pesticide registration fees. There's just a whole, I don't want to just tie it to
Yeah.
lessees. Just requires a one-to-one match.
So if I can on the motion, where'd Jason go? Oh, it's Jason. Jason, so my only thought is that when we talk about that, I just want to make sure that we're, because I don't think you are, want to make sure that with that amendment, as you just heard it, this conceptual idea. What I don't want state lands to have to come up with more money from somewhere else. So to make sure they're spraying on the school foundation, on at least on the school foundation properties. I just want to make sure, so do we need to do anything in that? Does that concern you at all with the motion we just made, that somehow you might have to come up with money on, at least on state, on the lands within the state, the school lands, that you have to come up with additional matches if weed and pest comes and says, say, we're going to spray the school section, we need a match from you?
Mr. Chairman, I greatly appreciate that question. We obviously manage a lot of other lands that aren't just tied to the school lands. 86% of the lands we manage are tied to that, but 14% are not. That's a few 100,000 acres that do have weed and pest problems that we would have to come up with funding somewhere, within our operating budget. The TP&E account wouldn't be available for us in that sense. So if there was a match that we were required to provide, that would be a problem for us. The other thing to note is that the P&E account was never really intended to do weed and pest work. It was expected to preserve and enhance revenue generating opportunities off of these trust lands. We've used it as a stopgap when we have problems in the P&E, in the weed and pest account, because it's a generally funded account. And those are the accounts that get hit by budget cuts. And so we supplant that with P&E when we need to. But those are expected to clean up dumps, to provide road building capabilities, to close roads, to do timber stand improvements, to do fire protections, things like that. And so when we use it for weed and pest work, we are not doing those other projects that are intended to generate more revenue off of these lands.
So, Mr. Chairman, I don't think Deputy Crowder understood what my motion was.
I mean,
I just want to have this discussion, make sure that we understand. I want to make sure that your motion wasn't anticipating that they would come up with additional lands to match, or additional
No.
funds to match.
No,
Okay.
any source doesn't affect the TP account. You're left whole. right? That was what the intent was, all those things you just articulated. That's why we always set aside weed control the last decade and a half as a second light item in there. What I'm trying to do is say that is still all available for those purposes you described. This money now goes to the Department of Agriculture with the authority to run the program on state lands for weed control. That this would be that's their responsibility, go out and get the match money. It's not to make state lands pay a match to the Department of Ag out of the same school foundations. It just bifurcates two separate programs. One TP&E still resides with the Office of State Lands. The weed control on school trust lands now would reside with the Department of Agriculture. That doesn't alleviate your responsibility for those other trust lands, and it's because of the source of the funding. That makes sense?
Mr. Chairman, I do think that that makes sense. It just leaves us a little bit bare on those 14% of lands that we manage that are on school lands. That's
So what you're suggesting that we take out just on the common school permanent land or on the school lands?
That's a policy decision. He would never suggest that, but
Absolutely
what's
not.
the answer to that question?
Absolutely not. But the definition we use is those lands under the jurisdiction of the board, which gives you a broad umbrella for everything that the.
So I would amend
Beneficiaries.
that motion that all state trust lands.
Okay, so we might have somebody complain about the 14%, but certainly you're 86% on spot on. Okay,
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
yes, Senator Simons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just wondered, because on page 4, section C, we're asking them to come back and work collaboratively to develop a appropriate budget request for the 23-24 supplemental budget. So then do we still need that language? Are you looking for 300,000 or 600?
Well, in some respects, I don't know that it makes any difference because if they've got this funding, then if maybe it's too much, maybe it's not enough.
Or should we?
And you
eliminate
never have to,
section?
you don't think you ever has to be shy. Agencies, I've never known agencies to be shy about coming back on a supplemental budget request unless the government told them no.
Mr. Chairman,
I mean, do we need C is all I'm.
Yeah, I
Mr.
don't
Chairman.
think you need to see whether it's in or
Yeah,
whether
I
it's
don't
out.
think so either.
Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
well, in
Kinsey.
furtherance of Senator Hicks's motion, in light of what we heard about what the department does not have with respect to weed and pest control, and this may be beyond our ken as appropriations, but on page 3, line 4, starting with the funding, I think that would be struck, line 5, line 6, and 7 through agriculture, period. Now, that may be beyond what our job is. What you're left with is the functions within the office of SLIB, minister weed and pest control should be transferred to the Department of Ag. For lands under the management of SLIB, Department of Ag shall coordinate with the Office of State Lands regarding weed and pest control and control efforts. Because there's nothing to transfer. And then I think all of B, subsection B goes out because it talks about transferring money that, just, and then I think you
I
keep
would add
C,
C.
and then C, you just strike out under line 4, funding property, and under 5, equipment and, so it says transfer of the authority mandated by this act. I know somehow we've got to clean it up, or else we just strike out the $300,000 that's referenced in here and go with Senator Hicks's amendment. Maybe we leave the rest of it alone.
I guess, we can certainly, if we go too far, we'll get slapped, but.
Well, yeah.
But I don't care about that. I mean, ultimately, it all has to do with the appropriation, whether appropriate
Yeah.
property or material or
Yeah.
anything else. There's nothing to
Okay.
appropriate, there's nothing to appropriate or transfer.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to just strike C too. If they end up needing something in the supplemental, we'll hear about it. I don't think we have. to
All right, so
tell
let's just hold that thought for a second.
Okay.
Let's go back to.
We have them.
Let's go back
we
to
do
the
have- let's go back to
conceptual.
Senator Hicks's motion,
Conceptual amendment.
and then we'll go back and go back to work on something else. So, all right, so any other questions or discussion on Senator Hicks's
Yeah,
motion?
Mr. Chairman, so effectively that conceptual is going to knock out the reference to $300,000 transferred in subsection B.
Correct.
Okay, I'm fine with that. Question?
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. That motion carries. Now, Senator Kinsey, you want to go back and let's
No,
go
I'm
through what you.
fine. I'm fine. I'll let joint ag worry about the rest of that language.
Okay.
I
That's how we did.
what we need to do.
I think it's fine. If you need us to work on amendment to clean some of that up. we certainly
Yeah, I think you should. I think you should look at that. And if with this, you just don't, most of the bill, it becomes a very, very simple bill.
Okay.
And one quick question before we got you here, Jason. So on the 14%, which are mostly state trust lands and some others, I mean, a number of those you receive, if nothing else, or at least the grazing leases on a lot of those. So where does that money go? And is that not available to participate at least in, and a lot of your lessees will provide the match on behalf of that for those state trust lands. I'm just trying to see, I just don't, I want you to be made whole, but I don't want you to have I don't have a $10 windfall either.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the 14% is made up of the 12 beneficiaries that are not common school or not the K through 12 fund. Those lands are largely just as scattered as every 16 and 36 across the state, meaning they have every use on them. They have a coal mine, trona mine, oil and gas well, and grazing and recreation to some amount. So they are largely managed exactly like common school lands are, and the revenues coming off of them are from the same sources that common school revenues are from. They're deposited for the benefit of those beneficiaries in the income fund or the permanent fund, just like the common school is. So it's not available to us for administration or operating costs at all. We do have to come back to the legislature for an appropriation to manage anything on those lands.
Okay, so, all right. So we got to figure out which pocket we're going to pull it from. All right, thanks. Appreciate it.
So, Mr. Chairman, just real quick, RJ, Senator Cost, once we get the amendment drafted up, what I'll do is sit down with you and the chairman, and then we'll have to have another amendment that you guys would bring as a companion to that to clean the bill up. So.
Okay,
Thank you. We'll do that.
anything else on the bill? All right, let's go ahead and do we all call a roll on this one? No, go ahead and call a roll on this one, Karen.
On Senate File 0008 as amended, Senator Guru.
Aye.
Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Kinski. Senator Steinmetz. Chairman Perkins.
Aye.
5 aye.
All right, thank you. Next item is Senate File 38, monthly ad valorem tax revisions. Bill of the Undead. Okay. Go on up. The no spare two of legislative initiatives. So, all right. Oh, so well-known monthly for ad valorem tax revisions. So the Joint Revenue Committee worked on this, which I understand seems to be a significant improvement over where it was. And if we want Jason to go through that, but at the end of the day, I think what happens is there's an additional $303 million from the state that gets appropriated, used to make loans to the county to cover the shortfalls. There was 16, and so if I remember right, there was 16 originally, but does this increase that by 16? Or let's help us with this appropriation, if you would, Jeremiah. I'm glad to have you here.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the County Commissioners Association. Mr. Chairman, this $3 million is an addition to the $16 million that was appropriated last year. This summer, you all asked us whether $16 million was sufficient to cover the transition that we're going to have, in particular, the first 6 months of this year. Working with your staff, Don Richards in particular, I contacted all of the counties to get a better understanding of where the situation standed. And so, Mr. Chairman, I've handed out or given staff a copy of a document that looks kind of like this, a spreadsheet. And Mr. Chairman, I'll just go through that really quickly. On the left side of the spreadsheet is a blue column. That's a set of figures for 6-month mineral ad valorem for each county. I received those figures directly from the Department of Revenue. If you look at the transition that we're making this year, counties under the new system, assuming that Senate File 38 passes, will receive 2 monthly payments. We started that system on January 1st of this year, but as it kind of flows out, counties will receive 2 payments. So what I did is began to break that down and first came up with a 4-month figure for each county. So pretty simple math, to get that 4-month figure. Nobody had any estimations for special districts. So what I did is took a statewide average, and I'll admit it's an average. There are some counties that receive or tax or have more mill levies for special districts and others that have low, but the statewide average is about 44% of what counties receive from ad valorem. So that's the calculation that you see there. What we also determined through the conversation is that community colleges are not calculated or were not accounted for anywhere in the previous discussions. The schools themselves, you'll remember there was an appropriation to cover them. There wasn't for community colleges. So I provide those figures for you in that 4th column. What I then did in this exercise is contacted each county to understand, did they need a loan? Were they intending to take a loan? What I found in that exercise is that 2 counties indicated that they would not take a loan for themselves, but they might for their special districts. Those 2 counties are Campbell and Converse County. That's why they're shown in red for the county portion. They were ultimately taken out of the figure or the calculations as I went forward. There were 3 counties that indicated they would take no loans for anybody. Those were Laramie County, Sheridan, and Sublette counties. So those figures are also taken out. I also looked at who had granted exceptions. You'll remember in the legislation that we passed last year that actually it was 2 years ago, that the counties could grant exceptions for companies to stay on the old taxing system. And so there were 3 counties that had granted some form of an exception. Campbell had granted 2 of those in litigation agreements, and those are noted on the right-hand side of that ledger. Lincoln County granted 4 exceptions. The total of their exceptions accounted for about 8% of the amount of ad valorem that they receive. So I reduced their number by 8%. That's why you see them in blue. And then Sublette County granted 8 exceptions. They weren't intending to take a loan anyway, so I didn't have to do anything there. The other notes that are there is just relative to whether the county intended to grant exceptions or might grant exceptions, and you see that there. The bottom line figure, if you go to the second side or the second page, once you go through all of the calculations and account for who intended to take a loan, who didn't, and the previous appropriation is that we needed an additional $2.8 million for county loans. And so the Revenue Committee put in $3 million for those loans. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for any questions about those figures or any other element of the bill that you might have.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Jeremiah? Right. Thank you. Go ahead.
I'd say this, I appreciate the work that he put into the spreadsheet.
Thank you.
That's greatly appreciated.
It's helpful. And so anyway. All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other questions about the bill? Anybody want any further explanation of the bill or anything like that?
Mr. Chairman, I was just wondering whether there's any members of the Revenue Committee.
I don't know. No, Revenue meets at noon on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I guess they didn't hear, or they had other places to be. So I'm sure we'll find out about it, about this. Unfortunately, I think most of us are all too aware of what this transition has been. Hi, Brenda. Welcome. Brenda, why don't you come up for a second? You know, it's nice to see you. Thanks for coming out. And it's a long day for all of us. I'm sure you've been involved in this process, I think. Do you have any comments about the bill in general or about the appropriations specifically?
Mr. Chairman, Brenda Henson, Director of Revenue. Specific to the appropriation, definitely the Commissioners Association has done the heavy lifting as far as doing the research and crunching the numbers. You know, we know that 2021 taxes, 2020 production, and then this gradual migration to the monthly ad valorem certainly is affecting our taxing entities with their budgets. We have this bill before you, and as we've stated historically, the last 6 months, we advocated at the Department of Revenue for changing the current statute that went into effect that required producers to report and pay ad valorem taxes on the 25th of the second month following production. So we advocated to take on that role of determining the county, the tax district, the mill levies, and calculating and creating an invoice that we will send to producers, and then they will submit payment. But now that payment is the 25th of the third month following production. So as Mr. Ryman indicated, we lost 1 month in that transition because of that. So the money is not going to start flowing until 1 month later. But with all things considered, we definitely felt at the Department of Revenue that it was advantageous for us to make those programming changes to one system at the department, as opposed to our 800 companies that are reporting to us having to try and determine what tax district and what the mill levies were last year. So we have already provided an opportunity for training for producers. Obviously, we went live with that monthly ad valorem system in that, as reflected in this bill, the first filers are the 25th of February, and that would be the 2021 annual filers, which are the folks that only have less than $30,000 in severance tax that they have owed. So we've got about 200 filers that will be filing this month, annual filers. We will then be generating an invoice by March 10th. That invoice will go out and they'll be responsible for paying those 2021 estimated taxes by the 25th of April. So, excuse me, 25th of March. So with that, it's just very, very important for the success of this migration to the new system that this bill pass. I'm certainly not in a position to lobby, as you know, but I will tell you, if this bill does not pass, we are not in compliance with the statute on monthly ad valorem. And I appreciate all of the efforts that the petroleum industry, the Commissioners Association, county treasurers have put into fine tuning this piece of legislation that gets us to a really good transition point. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions for Brenda? Brendan, just thanks. That's been a heavy lift for you. You were kind of behind the 8 ball when you walked in this. We were already way behind it. And so thank you for that. And thank you, Jeremiah and folks. I mean, there's been a lot of work in this. It wasn't right. And so we're getting closer, a lot closer. So thanks. Appreciate that. All right. Any other questions? Anyone else? Okay, we'll go ahead.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I was just wondering if we could do a call of the house to see if we get a chairman of revenue down there next time.
Well, we'll find a way to make them pay back tomorrow. We'll go ahead and take any other comments on this one. Hey, good afternoon or good evening, Mr. Obermuller.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks.
Pete Overmuller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Just very briefly, Mr. Chairman, you all are very aware that the appropriation and the previous money is to cover, it's essentially a bridge loan to cover the county in this transition. I just wanted to give the committee a brief update that when you take this up on committee of the whole, you'll see a standing committee amendment from revenue that just clarifies that companies that would like to can voluntarily pay that deferred taxes quicker. And I am aware of companies, including large companies, that are intending to pay in full the deferred taxes quickly. Obviously I can't promise that, but it looks likely that that loan will be repaid to you quicker than you might have anticipated.
Oh, thank you. And Brenda, do we need to send a notice off when that happens and you're making those distributions that don't get used to this because it's a double payment? It's the local jurisdictions. You need to remind them of that. I'm kidding. I'm kind of sort of
So-
kidding, but not
No,
really.
so, Mr. Chairman, the Department of Revenue only begins collecting the monthly payment on 2022 production. Anything that was produced in
Oh, that's going to be
2020,
collected locally. You're right.
2021
I'm sorry.
is actually collected by the county
Thank you.
treasurer.
You're
So
right.
we won't be sending them a bill
All right, thank you.
for that.
For that. All right, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you. Anything else, Pete? Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, have anything?
Mr. Chairman, no, we appreciate all of the hard work.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Anything else? Any amendments? Any
Mr.
amendments?
Chairman, you know, you referenced one of the previous chairman Nicholas on things, and so I know that he was fond of when the chairman of the committee came before the appropriation, didn't show up. Kind of a tradition, just to strictly appropriation out of it. But given the fact that the audience we have today, probably all have county tax and fall over if we do that. I'll just bypass that.
Yeah,
and
there-
say, move the bill. Mr.
Well,
Chairman.
there's exceptions to every rule. And yeah. So anyway, thanks. Plus, it's just, we already have, Pete's back there. He's hiding behind the pillar, but he already has a long face over this bill, has from the day one, which I understand. So we won't do that to him. Oh, okay, so go ahead and call the roll. Karen, please.
Yes, sir. On Senate File 38, Senator Guru. Senator Hicks. Senator Kinsky.
He left a proxy of due pass. I'll give that to you, Karen.
Thank you. Senator Steinmetz. Chairman Perkins.
Aye.
5 aye.
All right, thank you very much.
Just-
Well,
Mr. Chairman,
we'll just say that Chairman Philip Nicholas, he had a great sense of humor, but that sometimes it could be pretty cruel. We're adjourned. Oh, by the way, so
Sir,
just go ahead.
before
Karen,
we
anything?
adjourn, I do not have it in my records who moved the last bill, not 38. The one previous to
Senator
it?
Steinmetz moved that bill and Senator Guru seconded it.
Thank you very much for clearing that up for me.
I'm sorry we missed that. It may not have picked up on the tape. It was so faint.
I appreciate you letting me know that.
Okay.